Oh, yep. It's coming up on my end.
It's coming up on your end?
Yep.
Hey, everybody, this is our first live YouTube hangout here at the Douglas Stern Station. And with me today is Mike McNulty of Whatever a Spider Can, also does the podcast over at Spider-Man Crawl Space. And today we're going to be talking about the Amazing Spider-Man and the craft of writing and pretty much anything that kind of comes up along the way. But before we continue on, I kind of wanted to just let him introduce himself, say a few things, and then we'll get right on into it. So, Mike, thank you again for coming on. I appreciate it. I usually don't come out of my sort of like hidden bunker, and so for me to do that with someone, it is an honor to have you on. I really appreciated your work for like the past few years. So, thank you.
Well, thanks for having me on, Doug. Yeah, for those of you who they probably know me better by my nom de plume on the internet as Stillanerd, and the thing is, I basically how I got into this whole thing is, I guess, mainly because I just essentially was initially I was basically usually was lurking on various message, on the Spider-Man Crawl Space message boards, and then they were going through a different transition period, and so they asked me initially to, hey, would you like to write reviews for the site? And I was a little bit reluctant at first, and but then I eventually caved. And for some reason, people thought my stuff was good. And after I was working for a time, that's when I got contacted by the folks at Fansided, and they had a Spider-Man page called Whatever a Spider Can, and so they asked me if I wanted to edit that page, and so the rest is kind of history, and so it's been okay. I don't know if you want me to go into a little bit about how I got into comics initially.
Yeah, just real quick before we get into the Amazing Spider-Man and writing and all that kind of stuff, maybe like how your love for comics maybe started.
Okay, well, it's kind of funny because this is totally going to date me who I am. There used to be, once upon a time, there used to be there was a company called Power Records, in which they basically came out with a series of basically reprinted comic books where they attached like 45 RPM vinyl records. So yeah, these were, because yes, they're, so the idea was that they were basically, so you have the comic book there, and then you were just basically, and then they would play, and I guess people would reel on it and reenact what was on the page. And so I had I think like an aunt or something gave me a bunch of those, including like stuff like Batman, the Incredible Hulk. I think there might have been a couple Star Trek ones in there. And one of them was Amazing Spider-Man, but it was an original story called involving Draco the Dragon Man, which was basically basically, for those who don't know, imagine essentially the Lizard, except he's 10 feet tall, has wings, kind of yellow Speedos, I guess, and who can breathe fire from his hands, mouth, and feet. And he basically, the whole story, the conceit of the story is that he was supposed to be supposedly an alien from the constellation Draco, who is coming over to invade the planet Earth with his minions of dragon men. And then, so there's this whole thing with Spider-Man is basically told by, trying to find out who this guy is and stuff. And so, and as I was listening to it, I was kind of hooked. And I then got another one of these things, which was a reprint of, I think was, and I didn't know this was a time, it was a reprint of the original Man-Wolf story. That was the story. Man-Wolf was a character who was supposed to be J. Jonah Jameson's son, who was basically turned into a werewolf because of some moon rock that he had. and so it was kind of like, and it was a little bit, and I thought at the time when I was very young, I thought that was pretty scary and stuff like that. So then that's kind of where my Spider-Man hook kind of came in. And of course I saw some of the old cartoons from the 90s, which was, and also the reruns of the Spider Friends and stuff, and so that's kind of, and eventually got more into comics when I kind of got into my teenage years along with my brother. He was more into like the more grim and gritty stuff, if you will, like Punisher and Ghost Rider, where I was kind of more of the felt more like I was kind of gravitated more like towards the more, I guess you would say, the more traditional superhero types,
Gotcha.
like Spider-Man and Batman and X-Men and stuff and everything. So yeah, so I never, and ever since then I was kind of, kind of became kind of a comic book geek from that point on. So
Yeah, I think I had the exact same Spider-Man, that Draco thing that you were talking about. But there was
yeah,
also, I had a DC version, like a Batman. It was like a cassette tape sort of thing.
yeah, there
Follow
was
along.
there was a couple there was a couple of them that did that. There was a Batman one which was basically a Joker story, where he steals like a Picasso, and then there was another one that I think that DC came out with, that they had a series of cassette tapes, was called the Untold Legend of Batman, which was basically recounting Batman's origin story and Robin's origin story and some of the origins of the villains.
Whatever the one that I had, they had like some sort of like, like either classical music or like there was like an orchestra that was like playing with
Yeah,
like dramatic music.
yeah,
And
it's probably.
I loved that thing. I just loved it to death. I would
Mhm,
like listen to it over and over again, and at like the
mhm.
climax, there's just like the music was soaring and stuff like that. It
Oh
was
yeah. Mhm. Yeah, they had those that they yeah. I mean that's part of the things what I, because I'm also kind of a like a if you ever go back and you listen to like old recordings of like old time radios from like the 30s and 40s,
right.
and so I kind of, because that to me was always kind of another geeky thing that I got into too, was like this, some of those old, listening to some of those old shows, and you kind of get like that you can kind of use your imagination more and stuff like with, and so you can kind of, and so in a way, because with the comic books with comic books, and since there's mostly visually oriented stuff, and then you're hearing that kind of that sound recording effect things along with it, that kind of, it gave you kind of a very different, interesting, more experience than you would normally would have if you just kind of sat there and just kind of just read along. So because you're kind of using more of your senses involved, and therefore you can retain a lot more of the story. So uh, but which I always thought was which I thought was kind of, always kind of a fascinating thing. So but
Excellent. Real quick for me, and then we'll like run into it. I got into comics. I may have told you this before, like off the grid, but when I was little, in addition to those particular audio sort of comics,
Mhm.
my youngest memories was like my oldest brother. He would sit me on his lap on like a chair, and this like
Mhm.
ugly green chair, and read like Spider-Man comics and Iron Man comics to me and stuff like
Mhm.
that. And basically, I learned how to read on Marvel comic books, The
Oh
Amazing
yeah.
Spider-Man,
Mhm.
and so I ended up getting The Amazing Spider-Man. My brother got Spider-Man, but also Iron Man. And then my other brother, he was
Mhm.
into like X-Men and X-Factor and Daredevil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then like random, so we would all like have our own like a little allowance, and we'd buy
Yeah.
like different books, but like all three of us together buying kind of like different books. We
Mhm.
had like a really nice kind of collection, and you
Mhm.
could trade them. And we were really good about like not ripping them and like putting them in bags and stuff,
Right.
and
Mhm.
learning how to take care of them at a very early age. And like, and then if you like ever randomly like did like turn the page and it like ripped a little, you're just like, no.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, because my dad had a bunch of these. He's got a bunch of the one they call the classic illustrated comics, where they basically reprinted a bunch of classic literature, and some of them are in better shape than others. And so
Right.
you can kind of tell which ones were kind of read more and leaf through compared to some other ones. And so you're thinking, oh, the kind of the damaged ones must be the ones that were really good. So it's kind of, um, but yeah, I mean, yeah, I know the feeling about that. So.
All right. So, well, I guess since everyone kind of knows where we're coming from, our past, we'll like get right into it.
Mhm.
Both of us kind of, have a love for writing and the craft of writing, and
Mhm.
that's kind of where this kind of comes in, using like Amazing Spider-Man as the backdrop for that. So, I guess I wanted to talk about character-driven stories versus plot-driven stories,
Okay.
that sort of thing. Your thoughts on that, like the industry, particular writers. Obviously we'll be talking about like Dan Slott, how all that kind of comes into play, and whether one is better than the other, or how it should kind of come together into a nice, concise whole. I don't know. I guess I'll let you kind of just go off on that, and then we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, the thing is about the idea of like the whole issue about plot driven versus character driven. I was actually talking to a another writer the other day, and we were kind of got into some of sort of a similar discussion. And in some ways, like in some ways, when it comes to kind of where you're thinking about plot driven narratives, especially when you look at some of these more of the kind of the event driven stories that you often find, like Civil War II and Inhumans versus X-Men, and even clone, and of course the clone conspiracy that we just got out of with in Spider-Man. It almost feels like that the way some of these guys tend to write, it's almost like they're playing a board game. Like when you have your tabletop board game and you're playing, like, let's say Monopoly or the Game of Life, and so there is a beginning point at the start of the board, and then you got another point, then you got the end point, and then there's a certain path that these pieces have to follow, and there's these little obstacles that they put in their way, and then you just have to roll the dice or spin the wheel, and then they move their little pieces or characters along this preconceived path, and then and then they just kind of like, here's your starting point, here's the end point, just go along that way. Nothing necessarily wrong with that. I mean, there's a sense of structure, there's a sense of like you kind of know where the different beats are. The problem is characters tend to kind of, ideally, they kind of should be allowed to do their own thing rather than kind of be so confined to sort of like just this rigid pathway, because
Right.
people in real life, I mean, we kind of tend to do things based upon, not necessarily, we kind of have a sense of free will. We kind of we sort of do things based upon our, who we are, what our background is, or what our emotions are, people. So when you kind of try to force characters to try to do things conform to a certain way, that's where you start noticing like things that seem seem a little bit off. And I think in some ways, for example, with clone conspiracy, for example, just briefly, the whole thing about that whole thing about with Peter Parker, essentially, he goes in there. I mean, he goes in there with the idea that, oh, these are just about with the Jackals clones and the reanimates or whatever, and he kind of just sees them as what they kind of are, as clones. There was even that one issue of, I think it was what, like issue Amazing Spider-Man 23, where one of those interlude things where he's having that conversation with Gwen Stacy, and he even brings up the idea of well, I've not, and he even says, well, you are a person and I respect you, but you're not the real Gwen Stacy. You're just a clone. Right. And she gets all upset and stuff. But then over in Clone Conspiracy 5, for some reason, he suddenly, we don't really know why, but he just kind of changed his mind. Somehow he sees her as the real Gwen.
Right.
There's that line where he even sees that line. Yeah, go ahead.
No, there's like that moment where he says to her, he is just like, I know the real Gwen Stacy when I see her, or something like that, like indicating that, like, their love has been rekindled in that like final moments or something. But you're like, wait a second. The previous issue, you just said the exact opposite.
Right. And so you can kind of, and so in a way, and then towards, as you get towards the end of the story with Clone Conspiracy Omega, where he's like all kind of sad and depressed because he felt like, oh, I've lost Gwen all over again. And again, you're thinking, wait a minute, just mere moments ago, you were thinking you saw her as just another clone. Now, for some reason, you're thinking that she was the person you loved that brought back to life. And so there's that transition there from, so you can kind of see that where where the idea where the story was supposed to go clearly was he was supposed to kind of have a change of heart, that he was supposed to have, that he was supposed to kind of see them as the actual people brought back. But we never really, there was never really kind of any kind of indication of how that happened. It was just because, it's just because the plot said it was supposed to happen, rather than that's something that the character himself kind of arrived at that conclusion or what have you. So that's why it kind of felt, that's why one example why it kind of feels a little bit false. Whereas if you say, another example, like an earlier thing of Dan Slott's work when he did the Amazing Spider-Man Renew Your Vows miniseries, and that to me was a lot more of a character-driven story. And I remember at the time, in the first issue, where he kills in that, and again, for those who don't know, Renew Your Vows is like an alternate set, was an alternate world set apart from the rest of the Spider-Man continuity, where Peter was still married to Mary Jane and they had a daughter. Well, in the first issue, Venom is threatening both Mary Jane and their daughter Annie, and they get into a fight. And then in that issue, Peter kills Venom. And I remember at the time looking at, so there was some criticism of that scene. We're thinking, well, Peter wouldn't do that. Peter wouldn't kill Venom. That's, he's not that kind of guy. But to me, to see that was felt more true in character, because if you look at the context of what's going on, is that this is someone who, someone who was threatening the life of not just him, but his wife and especially his daughter.
Right.
And so when someone who becomes a parent, their priorities change, and they have a different kind of, they suddenly have a different view set of the world. And essentially, and I think Peter Parker is no different. I mean, as the character, of course, grows, and as people grow, we have different, we are what we usually think of as children, some children or teenagers, changes over time. And we have different mindsets. And I think that's, to me, fit perfectly with who he was, as it was presented in that story. And also, it wasn't like he was not what happened, because then the next issue goes into, like, he has a nightmare about that incident, and essentially Eddie, in that dream, Eddie Brock tells him, like, oh, it's not me, it's the symbiote. So there's that sense, it goes back to that sense of guilt that Peter characteristically has, which is, could I have done something differently, or was there another way? And so, because Peter Parker is a character, I'm sure, as you know, he's a character who's always haunted by guilt. He's someone who always feels like he is someone who is driven by it, because ever since his Uncle Ben got killed and shot, that he feels like that, he feels like he has to make amends for what what he failed to do, or what he refused to do. And so that's kind of, to me. And so if you're going to approach stuff in that manner, if you're going to approach things where the characters, who the character is, and who they are emotionally and psychologically, to me, that makes for a much more interesting, fascinating stories, rather than just basically, like going back to that game board analogy, rather than here's your pieces and you just kind of follow your set path and everything, and just,
Yeah, I mean, I kind of feel that I've said this on my own blog before, that Dan Slott works best when he's kind of kept on a short leash. And the story is like fairly contained, and there's kind of a clear, concise idea of what, okay, Peter in Renew Your Vows, he's gonna kill someone and cross the Rubicon or whatever. Yeah. And then what are the implications of that within his family? But then when he gets into these giant sort of big idea sort of things, where it's the clone conspiracy, they're reanimates, but they're not people, but they are the people, the originals.
They're still clones, but for the sake of the thing, is they try to say, oh, they're the people that were remanded from the dead, even though they're technically not. But but go on.
You get he's okay, 6 months from now, I need to get from point A to point Z or whatever. Yeah. And then it almost feels like 4 months in, he's like, uh-oh, I gotta get there.
Yep.
And then that's where you get like, you know, Peter like shoehorned into like bizarre situations and saying things that he wouldn't have otherwise said. And that, I guess, is probably dovetails nicely into like the next part of this conversation, was which does the serial format kind of like lend itself to one way or the other, or, you know, like however you wanted to kind of address this sort of aspect of like Dan's particular tenure on the book.
Well, I mean, I think with the superhero comics, I mean, or at least Western comics are by general, they're kind of designed to be what they call continuous middles. That they're just because it's, you know, it kind of like here's one story that leads in the next story and leads in the next story, and so you can kind of understand that they kind of have to, you know, with the since these superhero comics are based, and you know, especially with Marvel and DC, since they're kind of part of a business, they're kind of a business, and they're dealing with all groups of characters, and they want like a certain status quo and stuff. So they figure, it's probably a lot more. There's a greater tendency for them to kind of like, they have to be at a certain place, and it really doesn't matter how we get there, just as long as they get there. I think whereas, you know, normally, I mean, if some of these things are not necessarily part of an event, that's where you're kind of find more of the character driven stuff initially. Like, I know you've been a fan of Charles Soule's Daredevil, for example. And yep, do a little plug on there. But yeah, I mean, and again, there's, you know, he's doing stuff that's actually going back into who Matt Murdock is. Whereas, but at the same time, but he's also was kind of like one of the co-writers for Inhumans versus X-Men.
Right.
Which I don't know if you actually read that, but it got into some.
I saw some of the reviews, which almost indicated that like there was more editorial mandates that were kind of pushing him into things that maybe, you know, he didn't really have as much control as like he does on Daredevil, where it was like, hey, we're doing this event. I don't know how it works behind the scenes, but it was like, you want to do it, we'll pay you X amount of money, but you got to craft it within this box that we're making. And he's like, okay. You know?
I mean, because the whole idea was, because it's all supposed to be setting up the new status quo for the X-Men and the Humans and stuff like that. But just but the whole way that they got there, you can kind of see that because of the inner politics of way Marvel is, because they got their certain issues with film rights and stuff. Obviously, they have to try to promote the Inhumans more than they do the X-Men, even though the whole thing with the Inhumans, they're clearly in the wrong, because their charge in Mist Cloud that's supposed to be turning people into Inhumans, but it's killing mutants. But somehow the Inhumans still have to come out looking like the good guys, versus, you know, certain members of the X-Men who have to kind of like, but again, you're right. It's more of like you can kind of definitely tell that there is definitely more of an editorial interference going on. Same was probably true with Civil War II, which was just which was supposed to be setting up the entire Marvel landscape and stuff. And in a way, I mean, and of course, if you really want to go back to what they do, the epitome of editorial interference was, say, something like Spider-Man, you had, of course, the Clone Saga, which was that. I mean, if you ever read, there's a blog out there called The Life of Riley, which is a really fascinating read, because they actually got in touch with the different creators that were working on those comics at the time, and they were talking about how, going into stuff, the behind the scenes aspects of how those things were created, and how a lot of it was part of the reason why that whole thing got extended because it lasted for 2 years.
Right.
And how that whole thing got extended, because at the time it was one of the few comics that was actually making any kind of money in terms of readership. People were kind of going into it because they were kind of invested in it. So the bean counters there were thinking, hey, let's milk this for all it's worth, because they figure, hey, it's something that's successful. And of course, naturally kind of dragged on. And you kind of see this a little bit even today with certain series, when they announce your certain event, driven storyline where it's usually starts off as usually was always advertised initially as 7 issues, but then it got extended to like 8 because, and they usually cite for something like because our delays or what have you, or some such. But again, they also throw in some other like one shot little tie-ins or little other little tangent miniseries, just because again it's just try to like extend the sales of the thing, because of course they figure that events essentially they do sell. I mean, they usually, when you look at monthly charts, I mean, usually it's always the event driven comics that are usually at the top of the charts.
Well, that's the kind of on that, like, so Civil War II was one of those where like that was extended longer, there was delays and stuff like that, and I bought all of Civil War II. I reviewed it. I didn't particularly like it at all, but then immediately after that, then we're like, now it's X-Men versus Inhumans, and I was like, I can't do it, man. Like, you're tapping me out. I can't keep doing all these events. And
now you're going, and now they're going into the Secret Empire, again, which is now which is even longer, which is going to be like 9 issues, and then and along with all these different, and it's got different one shots and everything else. So yeah, there's that event fatigue kind of setting in a little bit too much. I mean, but I mean, again, that's kind of the way
the character versus plot driven. Like, I almost feel like there's like a yin and a yang. Like, that's what it is. And like the job of the writer is like to navigate that narrow sort of pass in between the yin and the yang. And if you could get that, where you have like both, that's where you have like the best stories that are the most memorable or something.
Right. Oh yeah, I mean, because I mean, it's usually, to me, it's because I mean, these different characters, these Marvel superheroes, we are attracted to them for a reason. I mean, we usually, I mean, even if the story is not very necessarily good, we still want to know what happens next with them. That's usually, and in a way, that's kind of where, in terms of a simplistic view, that's where some of these, that's why I think some of these comics do better than others, because they're depending on which comic book it is, we do want to know what happens next. Even with something like, for example, like Superior Spider-Man, for example, even as people who were just up in arms about that comic and the idea of Doc Ock killing Peter and taking his place and stuff, at the same time we still kind of wanted to know what happened next in that story, even though we kind of were, at the same time, even though we kind of knew, we're thinking, this is, we're kind of getting, pushing our, Dan Slott was pushing our buttons and getting us all outraged enough. At the same time, we still kind of gravitated toward it. We still wanted to go out and get it because we wanted to know what happened next, because we wanted to see where he was going with it. Even if it was a little bit on, even though the whole story was kind of, even if it went on a little bit too long and all the characters in it were kind of taking what they call we're basically taking as one.
Right, and that was one of those where I was always of the mindset, like, I didn't really care that Doc Ock, found a way to run around New York City with spider powers. Like, I was okay with that. My thing was like the way that Peter Parker went out, kind of like, I felt like he went out like a punk. And then
he did. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, but
and then the length of time that they kept this particular character dead. I mean, I know Dan Slott, anytime you bring up like kids, he's like, oh, the kids argument. But like, I think about my most formative years, my like 7th and 8th grade were like really huge. And I was a big comic fan. And like now I put myself in the shoes like of a kid. Imagine like Spider-Man just disappearing for like a year and a half between 7th and 8th grade, like not having him.
Yeah.
And then like the Spider-Man that you do have is this megalomaniac who, just came off of trying to kill 7 billion people prior towards taking up the mantle of Spider-Man. Like, I don't know. It was one of those things where it's like, just because you could do something, it doesn't mean you should do it. And I feel like a lot of writers these days, like even with the Hydra Cap thing, there was a guy the other day that was just like, I think it's great storytelling. This and that. I was like, yeah, it might be like the idea of mind control, whatever. I don't care. Like, yeah, maybe you could do something really cool with that. But if your character, your guy, is Captain America, do you want to see him by the time this is all done for basically a year and a half, 2 years, be like evil incarnate? I don't know. Right. I don't.
Well, yeah, I mean, and I think in a way, it's kind of like, it's almost kind of funny because in the sense that this, I think in some respects, the Superior Spider-Man, in almost the trend, that thing with the Hydra cap, in a way, that kind of almost came out of that kind of that Superior Spider-Man mindset. It's like, oh, let's make the hero kind of like almost kind of a villain, but still be a hero. Because shortly after Superior Spider-Man, we had Superior Iron Man, where they basically made Tony Stark into a kind of a real jerk again. They also kind of did that, and Hydra Cap's kind of the same. I think it's kind of in a way the same mold, and so in a sense, it's like because it's almost feel, and again, and then they're almost in a way going back to sort of a Superior Spider-Man with a Superior Octopus now, but it's kind of like, but yeah, it's this idea that they're kind of that they again going to this idea of the event-driven thing. They kind of it's this way of trying to grab people's attention and get them to get shocked, like, oh my gosh, and everything, even though we kind of instinctively know how things will go back to normal eventually. But again, it's kind of like, and they also know that since we are already invested in them, we kind of, that's what we want, that's why we keep coming back to it, because we do want to see what happens next, how these things are going to be resolved. But in the meantime, yeah, so in a way that it is kind of, there is a sense with the event-driven stuff, there is kind of a way they do kind of able to these writers and artists and creators, are able to kind of hook you and grab you on an emotional gut level. So they are masters at that. It's just now whether or not the actual stories are good, whether it has good characterization or dialogue or plotting, that's a totally other separate issue besides and everything. But the hook part, they've done, I think they do quite well. It's just everything. It's that sometimes when you get into these events, it's everything else that kind of gets problematic.
Right. And that sort of gets into like critic reception versus audience reception. So they do all these events, and even if you go into something like, say, like Iron Man, now we have like infamous Iron Man. Tony Stark is dead.
Well, no, he's not dead. He's in a coma.
Yeah, okay.
He's in a coma. He's in digital consciousness state. But I know what you mean. Yeah.
He's whatever. And like, I don't know if you've been following Invincible Iron Man at all.
A little bit, yeah.
His AI version, it still exists, and Riri Williams is like essentially Iron Man, Ironheart.
Yeah.
But now they've like planted the seeds where maybe AI Tony is evil.
Yeah.
And he's kind of come to the conclusion that humans are the problem. So it's like, you kind of like knocked Tony out of the picture, or he's in comatose for like over a year.
Right, yeah.
You make Dr. Doom a version of Iron Man. And the AI version that you do have might be some sort of like Cyberdyne or whatever, like T2, sort of like, artificial intelligence gone mad. And so you'll go to like mainstream comic websites, and this will even be with like, I know on when you guested on the Spider-Man Crawl Space podcast, you guys do the around the horn sort of like the web, and you'll have these. There was one on your last podcast where they're like, basically, Clone Conspiracy, the conclusion stinks, but 8 out of 10 or something like that.
Right. Yeah.
You're like, okay, I'm not really following.
Yeah, the logic. How can something be that? How can you get that kind of rating? But still, it's like, oh yeah, this wasn't really that necessary, and it really wasn't that great.
Like I feel like, so on YouTube Hangouts like this, or YouTube channels, or random places like Spider-Man Crawl Space, you'll actually get honest feedback. Like some of the guys on Crawl Space, early on they gave Clone Conspiracy, they were like, hey, this is like pretty good setup, and they were giving it like B's or whatever. And then as it went on and this weird stuff started happening, they were like C, D, F, and that to me was like, that's like, yeah, anyone who's being intellectually honest, like you could see the trajectory of this particular storyline. But why is it that like certain sites that shall remain unnamed like consistently, like they'll just give it like 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, like what is going on?
Well, I think in some ways I kind of think maybe it could be a combination of a couple things. One is that maybe the people who are reviewing the particular comics, they like maybe they like the character, maybe they're fans of that particular book, essentially already. And there's always of course, if there's a tendency that if you are a fan of something, you don't want to necessarily bash it.
Right.
I mean, there's some of that level. Other parts of it, I think, could be that, well, they don't want to get too mad. They don't want to try to sound too negative, because if you give something a bad review, then that's going to affect, that may affect future endeavors later on. But I think also it could be that in some cases, since some of these guys are doing, the major comic book news related websites, since they're doing like multiple reviews at once, I believe sometimes the idea of having tried to do any kind of in-depth critical analysis sometimes can get lost. That they're more reacting kind of on a more of a towards some of these books on kind of a more of an emotional gut level, like how they how they actually felt about when they were reading at the time, rather than actually kind of doing what in some ways where most critics or try to aspire to is try to make, okay, let's try to take try to be more like in-depth and more critical analysis of.
That's where I've noticed, like and anyone who's watching this right now, I've linked to whatever Spider can below, so you could check out Mike's reviews. But like, I feel as though there's a real like dearth of people. I'm kissing your butt right now. That people that like take the review and they're actually like turning this over, in their mind and trying to see where it works at a technical level. And then like other people, like you said, it's more of like a gut reaction. Like it's like almost this disposable sort of creative sort of sugar cookie that like, it's like, I liked it, I didn't like it, or something. And, you're actually treating this as a serious art form. Whereas like other people are either treating it like like I said, something disposable, bubble gum that you could just chew for a little bit and spit it out, or like they're like secretly want to get into the industry and they want to be friends with Dan Slott. So they're just going to be like, greatest story ever, dude. Hey, what are you doing after the con?
Or you get a situation where it's like the two extremes. It's never usually something like rarely. Sometimes you see something like it that's in the middle. Like it's either got to be something that's like either it's the best thing ever or it's the worst thing ever. There's rarely kind of that middle ground sometimes, because how dare you have kind of nuances about something, but it's the thing. One of the things that, I mean, the way I kind of think that if you're going to be viewing something, and you have to look at it like whether it's going to be a book or a movie or a television show or a comic book series, you kind of have to look at it as in the sense of, okay, you do have to kind of treat it as use it as an art form, as a serious analysis, because because in part because this essentially when we look at entertainment, we are investing our time and money into these things, and so we have and so people, and so you kind of have, so when people just say, oh, it's just a film or just a movie or whatever it is, or just a story, at the same time you kind of think, well, at the same, but we are kind of we are basically, we have kind of almost like a contract act with you, Mr. Writer, because we're trying to invest ourselves in the story and everything. And if it's not, and if it's a good story, and if it's good, then we will more likely come back to your stories. And if it's not, then we're going to stay far, far away.
Right.
And so, I mean, it's, so you kind of almost, I think, so I think it's as a critic's or reviewer's job is to try to approach this stuff as basically try to be as honest as possible and just say, look, this is what you're going to be, you're potentially getting. These are, and again, saying these are, make it clear that these are just your personal opinions and stuff. You don't have to necessarily listen to it, but this is what I genuinely thought about this thing. And, you know, and if you're interested in this kind of stuff, okay. If not, but
like when I read your reviews, right? So
yeah.
I feel as though, like, whether you were reading Moby Dick or Renew Your Vows, you put in the same, like, you know, intellectual sort of like energy in terms of doing your review justice and kind of from a writerly standpoint, saying like, you know, and I think that, you know, so certain creators are just like, it's just a comic book. Even the creators, which like to me is insane. You're actually doing them. It's like an honor, or you're paying them the respect that you would hope that they would put into creating the story. Like, you know, not everyone's going to be Herman Melville, but at the same time, they should aspire to create stories that like 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, someone's going to like pull this out and read it and be like, wow.
Yeah,
this guy,
I mean,
got it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like, for example, that's kind of the way I look at, for example, if you're going to comic books, that's how people, why certain, you know, comic book stories, like, for example, Alan Moore's Watchmen, or Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. And I would even put J.M. DeMatteis's Craven's Last Hunt from Spider-Man in that same category, because these are because they're trying to, because these are stories which kind of, in a sense, they're in a certain genre, if you will, but they're stories that kind of last, that they kind of speak to them, because these guys were able to put the time and effort into those stories, and to try to make to make them to kind of the best they can, and make them the kind of, and put dedication into their craft. And so I kind of feel like, that if you're doing any kind of critical analysis of stuff, you have to kind of, you know, treat them with sort of like the respect, or maybe that you would think that that those creators would hope to have, and essentially, because if they put in the time and effort into those things, then it kind of should be a critic's job to kind of treat it as such, to try to, you know, and because if you want to kind of judge it as a work, as any kind of work of art, or to basically call it on, you know, if it's, or just call it on or their lack of art thereof. I mean, but yeah, it's again, it is, I do think you kind of do have to kind of approach these things with not necessarily reverence, but essentially kind of a, you know, with a more discernible eye, rather than just kind of like sit back and just kind of be just basically kind of a wash, you know, basically get just like emotionally just get washed in, like if it like you're treating it like, if, for instance, like it's just a regular popcorn flick, like Transformers, for example. But so
I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit here, just because of the questions that we've come up with. Normally I would save them towards the end, but this kind of gets into with like the writers. One of our viewers, Singleton, he wanted to ask, like, he basically said, is there even any such thing as superheroes and supervillains anymore? And I guess this kind of gets into like the character-driven stuff we were talking about earlier, where it almost seems like the line has been blurred between superheroes and supervillains. So that's like why you have, like, you know, why is like Spider-Man flipping to Superior Spider-Man? Iron Man becomes Iron Doom or whatever. He's evil. Captain America, Hydra Cap. You know, it just seems like over and over there's sort of this sort of like blurring of the lines between hero and villain, and maybe that's having an effect on, the quality of the stories as well.
Well, I think in a way, I would argue that actually that blurring of the line goes back even further than what we see now. I mean, in a way, in some respects, that kind of started back with, if you go back with like kind of the 1980s, and like where I mean, again, going back to Alan Moore's Watchmen, for example, great, great, great story, great comic book, graphic novel series. But the idea from that, if you read that, a lot of the characters in that, they're kind of almost in that, they have questionable morals too, a lot of them, and they're not really good and not really evil type thing. And so I imagine a lot of creators at the time when they read that, oh, that seems a lot more sophisticated. Which it is.
Yeah.
But in a way, they kind of took the wrong lessons from it. So what you're seeing is now is they kind of is that this idea that, that there's this kind of that moral relativist attitude that, it's not really good, they're not really bad, and everything. It's like everyone's kind of a gray thing where
yeah, or like
where it's just
going back to Superior Spider-Man, you could try and kill 6 billion, 7 billion people one day. 2 months from now, the guy is a hero.
Yeah, or that line from Clone Conspiracy 5 where Spider-Man tells Doc Ock, "I've been inside your mind, and you're not all bad."
Yeah, your review on that was like great. When I saw that, I was just like, yeah, the guy. And then like the next issue, he's hooking up with Hydra,
right?
Using them as a means to his evil ends,
right?
As the Ubermensch proto-clone / white nationalist looking, superior Dr. Octopus.
Yeah, with his Richard Spencer Hitler Youth hairdo going on. Yeah, but
right.
I mean, yeah. And it's I think again, there's this attitude, I think, in some of these guys that they feel like, they try to think that maybe it's more sophisticated to have somebody who is characters who are more morally gray, that are supposed to, that are clearly like, clearly is a good guy and here's clearly a bad guy, because they kind of, but yeah, I mean, I understand that question there, because it does feel like more often than not, we see way too many heroes versus heroes stories, which is, because again, that they figured, hey, Civil War did it. Why can't, so let's just repeat that formula over and over again. But getting lost in the shuffle is the idea that, that these guys are supposed to be superheroes fighting super villains. And I think
that leads into another question. Someone wanted to know what you thought about DC Rebirth. And I was thinking that would be a good example of like basically trying to almost recapture this idea that you don't always just have to have heroes fighting each other.
That's right. Yeah. I think in a way, DC Rebirth in certain respects, especially when they did with Superman, has been great. And I think in a way, you can kind of tell it's kind of weird, because it's one of those things where technically it shouldn't have happened, because with the New 52, you can clearly tell that they were kind of that when they were coming out with that, and everyone initially was on that bandwagon. They thought, initially they thought it was great because, hey, it looks fresh and exciting, and it's new, and we're rebooting our entire universe. But you can kind of tell after a while it was very slapdash.
Right.
That certain things were not that they always kind of had a similar style, and the things weren't quite meshing continuity wise. And there were certain characters that just really felt incredibly off. And I don't even want to go into the whole thing about the Superman romance with Wonder Woman, because, but, and the only one that really seemed to be okay and consistently well quality in terms of quality was Batman, because, it's Batman, and, Scott Snyder is actually a very good, storyteller. But yeah, after a while, I think at the time, I think DC eventually, they kind of finally essentially woke up, and they realized, we dumped out the baby with the bathwater. And there is a sense with DC readers, there's a sense of, in those comics, you get a sense that there is a sense of history and legacy and stuff, that there is something that, because they have this whole thing where there were heroes from a World War II period. And then you got, the more modern, like the Justice Society, and then you got the more modern day Justice League. And so I think, and so fans of those of DC kind of felt like there was something missing, like that simple, that good versus evil aspect in those comics. And so what you're seeing essentially with Rebirth, and you can even see it in the story itself, is this idea that, oh, because whoever is involved with restructuring, who interfered with the DC universe, it's probably they're clearly alluding it's Dr. Manhattan, but but the attitude there is essentially like, and even you can see it in that DC Rebirth special, like the idea that somehow the concept of love was missing, and that there was not there was not essentially a sense of love for these characters and their various relationships that was lacking. It was all this. It just seemed more, and you can see with the New 52, there's a kind of like cynicism involved there. And so the idea is what they're trying to do is like, okay, we're trying to bring the love back into this world, and the love for these characters and who they should be like.
That leads into like probably we're coming in on an hour, so we got like an hour on this broadcast, and that kind of is a great segue. Speaking of love, to talk about the marriage between Parker and Mary Jane. So recently, on some other comic message boards, Amazing Spider-Man writer Dan Slott apparently went to an extended rant on why the marriage will never, to infinity, ever come back. And we were just talking about DC kind of righting the ship, responding to the fans and the sales and all that kind of sort of thing. What are your thoughts on Dan Slott? I mean, I just read that. I didn't go to whatever website it was. I just saw the Bleeding Cool article where they kind of consolidated a lot of it. And it was basically him saying, like, if you ever think it's going to come back, you're an idiot. It will never come back. All caps abuse. That's a Dan Slott telltale sign. It's Dan Slott. If you see caps abuse,
right. Well, there's a couple things gone there. First, part of it has to do with the fact that there are, ever since One More Day, and I probably would include myself maybe in this mix, but there has been kind of a frustration with the fact that because it's that how that marriage got ended with Mephisto's magical marriage annulment, essentially, with One More Day, and ever since it's been going, and it is now we're approaching a decade now, and people are still kind of angry about that. And so from his perspective, I can understand in a way why he can get basically continually frustrated from people like, hey, when's the marriage going to come back? When's the marriage going to come back? And he's like, oh gosh, this thing again. So he's probably, I can totally understand, and I can totally get it. But, and also in a sense, if you think about it at the time, the various Marvel editorials and everything, because they've been trying to get rid of the marriage for years, not even before One More Day. And so they were trying to do it with that's how they were try to do a stealth get rid of it with the Clone Saga by having Ben Reilly be the original Spider-Man. Or there was even a point where they looked like Mary Jane got killed in a plane explosion by something. But again, so they put a lot of time and effort to try to kill this thing dead, essentially. So I can understand from his point of view why he would be frustrated by it, how, oh, it's never, ever, ever coming back. But at the same time, well, you never know. Maybe in another 10 years it could, because if you get different management.
I feel as though he's basically playing like Slot Stradamus. Trying to predict the future. When, I mean, if the people after like a decade are still, this is still kind of like the nerve is still damaged, and it's still raw after 10 years. Like, to me, that's a sign that, like, hey, if people care this deeply, when almost any other comic event, people are like, whatever, like, move on, whatever.
Yeah.
Like, Spider-Man fans they're just like, no, this was like special. Like he, it just seems bizarre to me, like without knowing what the comic landscape is going to be in 10 years from now. What are the sales needs going to be? Where's the culture going to be? To just say outright that it will never come back. I mean, that would be like a guaranteed at least a year or two's worth of like strong sales.
Right.
If you brought that marriage back in the regular continuity.
Yeah. And I think that, and the thing is about people, the reason why people I think are definitely still upset about One More Day, aside from the obvious, is because of the way it happened. Because the idea for Spider-Man's world, it's the idea that this was supposed to be, essentially, if you look at Spider-Man, essentially he's kind of it's almost like a coming of age story. It's almost like a person who's following a person who eventually grows and matures over time. And when you have something like this that literally was almost like a mini cosmic reset, it kind of violated that kind of idea that this like, oh, well, it doesn't really, that it basically told the reader, oh, this journey that Peter Parker is taking on, it's not going to matter. Because he's going to be, because for branding reasons, he has to be a certain character forever and always. And also, any relationship he now gets involved and henceforth, including if he ever tries to get back with Mary Jane, Marvel was essentially telling the readers, oh, it doesn't matter. Because it's not going to go anywhere after a certain point. It will eventually fall apart and everything. So this idea that when they were trying, when Marvel was, and under Joe Quesada, was trying to get back to this idea that Spider-Man should be more about like a soap, his romances should be more like soap opera, that, constant like drama there. It kind of reigns. You notice how afterwards, after One More Day, it kind of always ran false now, because the love interest is not really kind of up to par, because there's always that sense is, oh, that these are just kind of
flings.
They're not things. They're not really, they don't really matter. They're not really true.
They're these sort of like hollow sort of, in the case of Silk, it was like sex pheromones or whatever,
right,
making them.
they just randomly make out for no reason, because or Carly Cooper beforehand, who is essentially almost like a whose only defining characteristic was that she had nerdy glasses and that she was super smart. And that was it. And essentially that was pretty much it. But it was like, oh no, she's the best thing ever.
The next one.
What?
Leanne Tang.
Yeah, it's Leanne or Leanne, because they never can spell her name right. You notice that? There's always like, because even in 25, it's spelled, they spell it Lien instead of Lian. And so, you're thinking, well, geez, if you can't even invest in getting the character's name right, why should we be invested in this character? So,
right, and like they said, it's a serious relationship, and you're like, wait, we never even saw how it got that way, and then like 4 issues later, she literally tried to murder Spider-Man. Yeah. Was not even fired from her job, right, for trying to murder her boss.
And now you're getting into a situation, I guess now they're hinting at a possible ship tease between him and Mockingbird and everything like that. So,
like, I almost think on some sort of like metaphysical level, it's very interesting to see that after this Faustian deal, this deal with the, Marvel's devil or Satan or whatever you want to call him, that like there's been this bizarreness, throughout Amazing Spider-Man since that time. And I don't know. It's just, it's weird to me that like Marvel could say like, yeah, we'll make Captain America Hydragent, we'll do away with like Logan for like years and turn him into like Old Man Logan, but like Peter cannot get back with Mary Jane, and if you think that it should happen, you're off your rocker,
Right, yeah. Yeah, because again, I think in some ways with Marvel, they have a thing where there's a thing where it feels like it's almost kind of like it goes back to kind of almost a branding thing, because it goes this idea that because the way Spider-Man is presented in different other media, he's always supposed to be, he's that young guy who's not a young young teen, in some cases, teenage superhero who's not a sidekick to another superhero, is beset by personal problems, even though not a teenager and he hasn't been a teenager for decades and stuff. But it's again, I think in a way it's almost like it's kind of like that goes back to that the idea of the comics almost having Western comics have to have that kind of like almost that rubber band effect. Like it can't be stretched out to a point. If it gets stretched out too far, they
well,
they
it's
don't
like
yeah.
and I won't keep you too much longer here. I don't want to monopolize your day. But
Okay.
it's one of those things where it's like, oh, if we have him get married, like that's progressing the character too much, and he's not relatable. But oh, by the way, we're going to make him a billionaire Steve Jobs, Mark Zuckerberg type character,
Right. Yeah.
for like multiple years, jet setting around the world as, you know, wannabe Tony Stark, and we'll actually make references or jokes about him being a pale imitation of Tony Stark's in the book.
Yeah.
And you're just like, what? You know,
Yeah.
and then you look at Renew Your Vows, and that's a book where, you know, I have like little quibbles with it here and there, but it shows that you could have Peter Parker be married, you know, in his 30s and have a very vibrant, you know, compelling life, plenty of drama where kids would relate to it just as much as adults. And you're just like, you know, I don't buy it that making someone married means their life is suddenly boring and that like people can't relate to it.
Yeah, I mean, that series in a sense, I think it's definitely more like, because it is playing on the idea of approaching it as kind of like as sort of like Peter Parker as the family guy and everything, and also it's also pointing out essentially that if you give Spider-Man, the guy whose whole motto is "with great power comes great responsibility," if you give him more responsibility, then it actually increases the stakes, and because now he has potentially more to lose and more to look after. Now that series, I think I do with the new ongoing by Jerry Conway of Renew Your Vows. I do have the only real quibble I do have is like whether or not would he really allow his daughter to basically be a superhero. And I mean, I thought because she's supposed to be 10 and stuff, but again,
well, like if you go to Super Sons, that's one where like and it looks like, you know, I don't know if you've read this issue, but
not yet.
At the end of it, sorry to spoil it for you, it's ongoing, but like so the kids, they're out and about doing the superhero thing, but like it's clear their parents do not want them doing this really.
Oh no.
And at the end of it, it's like they're trying to figure out this sort of like, you know, murder mystery. And each child, they're doing their own thing. And then like, so Superboy, you know, Batman is like looming over him on the last page. And then with Robin, Superman is like looming over him like, okay, you guys are in trouble sort of thing.
Right,
it's just like, that's almost how I feel as though it would be with Renew Your Vows, but they're not really going that route with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because that's a book that's mostly focusing on not. I mean, even though it's titled Amazing Spider-Man, it's focusing on both Mary Jane and Annie as it's approaching almost like it's kind of like a Spider-Man version of the Fantastic Four or the Incredibles, essentially.
Right.
And so, and I guess so the conceit there is that Annie is like in the tradition of, say, a Robin or a Superboy is supposed to be like the kid hero and stuff. So, I mean, but yeah, I mean, so on that level, it's kind of like it goes back into sort of a wish fulfillment thing. But yeah, from a character standpoint, from Peter, you're kind of thinking, would he really allow her to do this and stuff? And there was even that one point where he gets in an argument with Mary Jane and stuff, and she's like, "Oh no, it's like, oh, you want to expect us to stay at home all the time?" Kind of like, but yeah, I mean, in a way, I do enjoy. I mean, I actually do enjoy that scene. I think it's actually a very good series compared to what's going on with Amazing right now.
There's like a levity to Renew Your Vows that is just it's just light, you know.
Yes,
you feel like it doesn't have all the baggage that's been placed.
That's been spoon-fed us also in the actual continuity. Yeah, I mean,
So anyway, all right, we're gonna probably wrap it up here. It's been an hour.
Okay.
I've really enjoyed this. Again, I thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join this chat in the future.
Mm-hmm.
You're always welcome anytime to come on. And I don't know if you want to plug your work one more time before we take off. Let everyone know where they could read your stuff and listen to you.
Yeah, you can go. You can usually follow my my reviews and whatnot on whatever Spider can, I should say, .com. And I'm also a frequent guest on the Spider-Man crawl space. And thank you for having me, Doug. And it's been a pleasure and talking with you, with all these nerdy things and stuff, and hope to do it again sometime.
All right. Thanks again, Mike. I really appreciate it. Thanks to everybody who kind of tuned in today, the people that asked questions. I'm going to try and do this again. I usually like to find guests that I know are going to be like engaging. And, for a first podcast, I couldn't think of anybody better than Mike McNulty. I've linked to his stuff in the comment section or the description section below. Check out his work on a regular basis. The guy is always spot on, super sharp, and always fair, always a diplomat in terms of dealing with the other creators. I'm really impressed. And again, thank you very much, and I'll see you guys next time. I'll be coming out with a couple of reviews in the very near future. All the comics that I've shown today, those are all up for possible reviews, but something will be coming within the next 24, 48 hours and on a regular basis. Again, thanks, Mike, and I'll see you guys later.
Okay.